So as we stand here today, almost 75 years to the day that Coventry was bombed and the cathedral that we see outside us was reduced to a ruin, you could almost think that Europe was once again at war. Because over the summer, we have seen a whole array of different images of people moving across Europe, of men, women and children moving in their thousands, their tens of thousands, indeed their hundreds of thousands, looking for protection and an opportunity to build a new life. And as Sabir said, I've just returned from Lesbos, and the desperation on the beaches of Lesbos is something that will stay with me forever. So the relief of those who make it, just that short 6-kilometre journey across the sea, but a journey that potentially is the difference between not just life and death, but between having a future and not having a future. The fear of those who think they won't make it and what that does to them, not just at that moment, but for the future. We've also, of course, seen over the summer scenes of people marching across Europe as they've entered through Greece and through Italy, looking for a place where they can get protection and build a new life. So you'll remember, for example, the scenes in Budapest in July and August, when people were prevented from moving on from Hungary to Germany, when Merkel had just announced that she would provide temporary protection, at least for those from Syria. And you remember that people just picked themselves up in the end and walked the walk because they couldn't sit there and wait for the politicians to come up with a solution. You'll also have seen the scenes, of course, when people were moving more recently through Slovenia, when the borders were closed with Hungary and people were forced to go on a different journey, a different route than they'd already intended in order to be able to get to that place of safety. So many of these scenes that we're seeing are, in a way, quite shocking, but they're not particularly new. They're reminiscent of things that we've seen before in Europe, and particularly they're reminiscent of the last major conflict in Europe, of course, which was the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, which took place between 1991 and 2002. And we saw then not just the movement of people from Bosnia, around 1.2 million people who left from Bosnia, but also the movement of people from Slovenia, from Croatia, and of course from Kosovo. So again, these scenes that we see are very reminiscent of that time. And they also, of course, remind us of another time in our history when there was conflict in Europe. And that takes us right the way back to the Second World War, that very war that led to the destruction of the cathedral outside our window. And at that time, it's important to remember that 60 million Europeans were made homeless by the conflict and forced to move. And of course, at the end of the war, that didn't mean that people didn't move. It meant there was a whole new population displacement as the new boundaries were born, as people were forced to move back and to different places. And so even 5 years after the conflict had ended, there were still around 1 million people who were displaced in Europe. And I think it's really interesting when you see the images, as I hope you're doing, to see the parallels in those stories of people moving around. And I think the other thing that's important to say about the conflict or the issues that we see around us now is it's not just the imagery that reminds us of war, it's also the language that's being used to talk about this current refugee crisis. So back in July, Cameron, our Prime Minister, referred to a swarm of people who were seeking to get into our country. And after that, in September, Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary, you remember, talked about the marauding Africans who were coming to undermine our way of life and our standard of living. So there's something about the imagery of those arriving in boats, the people who are presented as being the en masse threat to our, not just our security, but also our way of life, our way in which we organize ourselves economically and politically. They are represented as an undifferentiated mass. Mostly, it has to be said in terms of the imagery, as young black African men who in some way want to undermine our way of life. And across Europe, of course, in response to this sort of imagery, the fences have basically gone up. Nothing new. There's been fences going up across Europe for a long time. Indeed, the fence between Greece and Turkey that was built in 2012 is a large part of the current situation we see now, where people are taking to the water. And then in 2014, there was a fence built between Bulgaria and Turkey. But in 2015, that fence building has sort of escalated and taken a new scale. So the Hungarians closed their border by building a fence. The Austrians and the Slovenians are now following suit in order to try and regulate some of the movement. And I was in Brussels just 2 days ago and met a guy who was working in an organization in the Czech Republic who talked about he had recently traveled through Hungary and saw this fence, this very large barbed wire, razor wire fence, and how it kind of made his heart sink as he remembered chiseling away at the Berlin Wall, and here we have a sort of another iteration of it. So there is a language around this conflict, this crisis, which is very much the language of war. It's associated with fences, and with fences come talk of the front line, talk of the invasion, and in particular the talk of the Muslim invasion of Europe. And behind that story is a kind of backstory about some of the issues that we were hearing about from Emma, the kind of ISIS, the threat of ISIS, the fear of what might happen to Europe, whether people who are members of ISIS might be hiding amongst the refugees, wanting to inflict harm upon us. So that language of war is very prevalent in the imagery and what we see around us in relation to the migration crisis. But Europe is not at war. Europe is very much at peace in terms of its own security. It's one of the richest regions in the world. It's also one of the regions of the world that takes the fewest refugees relative to other countries, because the vast majority of people actually stay in countries and regions of origin. So what I wanted to do in my brief presentation just now is to really unpack some of what's going on here in terms of the imagery of war. What is this about? Why are we talking about this current situation in this way? And what does talking to refugees and migrants about their experiences do to shine light on some of the dynamics of migration that we're seeing? And one of the things that's really obvious to me, being in the places that I've just been in, is that this is a very unusual situation. Some of the images you saw at the beginning are from a Greek photographer called Aris Massini. And he recently wrote a piece called War in Peace. So it's not a war, it's a war taking place in peacetime, in the sense that it has some of the attributes of war in terms of the pain, the fear, the loss, the stress, the crisis. But at the same time, there is prosperity. The vast majority of people living in complete security. And that's why when you get, the boat landing on the beach next to the people who are sunbathing, the Daily Mail and all our friends in the press are infuriated by that, because it's not consistent with what we perceive to be war. War happens out there. It happens somewhere else. And so this war and peace idea, I think, is very interesting. So let's start with some numbers, because although I'm not a fan of numbers sort of dominating the debate, I do think they tell us a lot about some of the issues that are going on. Now, when I was asked by Laura to provide a little bit of a summary of what I was going to talk about today, I provided her what you've got in your pack, I guess, which is that since the beginning of the year, around 500,000 men, women and children have moved to Europe looking for protection and opportunity to build a safer life. That figure is now just short of 800,000. So the kind of rapidity of movement, the scale of the flow is something quite extraordinary. The big change, of course, in that time, even in the 8 weeks, has been in relation to the outflow of people from Syria. And I'll come on to talk about why some of those things are happening right now. But I think it's also important to put those figures into some sort of perspective, because, as I said earlier, the vast majority of migrants and refugees don't come to Europe. They physically can't make it in terms of having resources and opportunities for access. And so what they do is they move to countries and regions of origin. Around 86% of those who are displaced live in the developed countries. That compares to about 70% 10 years ago. So in fact, the trend is very much people not being able to travel internationally. We have countries like Pakistan with 1.5 million refugees, huge refugee camps in Darfur and elsewhere, and of course countries like the Lebanon, which have around 600,000 Syrian refugees in a place that effectively is the size of Cornwall. And at one point this summer, they had 10,000 people arriving every 2 days. that's the equivalent of what we're intending to take over, 5 or 6 years. So the scale of this is really important to understand in terms of the context. And I think this issue of legality is also important, because what we're talking about here is people who travel irregularly, who have no right to enter Europe to get protection or to seek work. The vast majority of people who migrate into Europe are completely legal. Hundreds of thousands, millions of tourists, of foreign students, of international students, of business people, of people joining their families. This is all a very legal, very normal kind of migration. But you don't see anybody talking about that. So it's the way in which certain groups are pushed out of the opportunities for movement, which then pushes them into a category which makes them more, if you like, dramatic. Now, I just want to sort of think a little bit about some of the causes of this migration, because it's really important to remember that ultimately the movement of the Syrians in particular, in much larger numbers, is a product not just of the conflict that started back in 2011, but what has happened in the subsequent period in terms of any sense of a resolution to that situation, and more specifically in terms of the recent development with the engagement of Russia directly in the conflict. So lots of people say to me, well, the Syrians are, if you like, good refugees. I mean, we often hear them being talked about in that way. But why are they moving now? I mean, why didn't they move before? Why are they coming to Europe now? Why don't they stay in Jordan? Why don't they stay in Lebanon? Why don't they stay in Turkey? Turkey's very nice. I go there on my holiday. And the point about what's happening now is that there has been a shift for two different reasons. One is about the conditions within which those people are living. So we know that there's a lack of resource in the camps, particularly in Lebanon and Jordan. And so it's actually very difficult to survive, to look after your children, to have enough food, to get access to work. But of course in Turkey there is no protection under the 51 Refugee Convention, because Turkey only grants protection to those that come from within Europe, and Syria is not part of that deal. So there is no long-term solution for people in terms of their status. And that really brings me to the second reason why I think people are moving, and I think it's really connected closely to the theme of this whole forum. I think the reason why people move, whether they're economic migrants or refugees, is because of a lack of hope. And so hope is a really important part of the dynamics of migration. And it's not something that's easily measured or talked about or researched. But when you talk to people about why they move, regardless of whether their motivation is economic or political, and usually it's a mixture of the two, what they want and what they need is hope. They need hope for the future, hope for their own livelihoods, hope for their children, a sense that they can build a future. And if the place where they're living won't offer them that, then often they'll choose to move elsewhere. Now, in the case of the Greek situation, we know that in the last period, particularly since the beginning of 2015, but specifically more recently, around 650,000 people have arrived through the Greek route directly from Turkey. So that gives you some sense of the lack of hope that people feel that they have in that context. Now, if you look at the countries of origins of those people, 93% of them come from the top 10 refugee-producing countries. So the majority are from Syria, around 2/3. But 25% are from your country, Sabir. They're from Afghanistan. We have around 7% that are from Iraq, and the other percentages are made up of various different nationalities. So it's very simple. Why are people coming? They're coming because there's war on the one hand, but they're also coming because they don't have a sense of hope for the future. You don't have to be shot at or feel that your house is about to be destroyed to not have hope. You also need to have hope that goes beyond into the future for yourself and your children. The other route, of course, that's been in the media because of the kind of the intensity of some of the flows has been the Italian route. So this is people moving across the Mediterranean from predominantly from Libya, and these are people who've either passed directly through Libya on their way from various countries in West and Central Africa, or who have been in Libya for some time, and because of what's going on in Libya right now, are finding it impossible to live, to survive. And so I think this scenario, although it's smaller in scale, around 150,000 people, if you look at the composition, is very interesting, because we have around a quarter that are from Eritrea, and that again is a country undergoing conflict and political change. But we also have a mixture of nationalities: Nigerians, Somalis, Malayans and Ghanaians, who are maybe starting off sometimes on that journey with purely or mostly economic motivations, but during that process of traveling to Europe find themselves becoming very much in refugee-like situations. And so this kind of very artificial division we have between the refugee on the one hand and the economic on the migrant on the other doesn't in any way reflect the complexity of the journey. And why is that journey so complex? Well, it's complex because we've made it that way. It's physically impossible for most people to fly directly into Europe. And so what they have to do is take this very often circuitous and difficult route into Europe that puts them into these situations of vulnerability and conflict, even if conflict wasn't originally part of their story. By the time they get here, it certainly almost will be. So as I say, I don't think we should underestimate the role that hope plays in the dynamics of migration. Hope for peace and security, hope for a livelihood, hope for a future for yourself and your family. It's a major driver of migration. And I think the theme of the conference again resonates very strongly with that the idea of this forum, the hard road to hope, for many refugees and for migrants, the road to hope for them is also very hard. It's also one that's very difficult and potentially very dangerous because of these lack of opportunities. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on that, and I'm trying to do so in my own work, because we are often pushed into talking about the dynamics of migration as if they're just about economics, as if somehow it's about rational decision-making. And of course, it's not about that at all. It's a much more complex set of emotions as well as logistical practicalities. And I came across, and a lot of us at the moment have come across this poem by Warsan Shire, the British Somali poet, who says, "You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." And that's not just about the water being safer, it's about the possibility of something beyond the sea. So on that basis, I really want to reflect on whether or not this is a migration crisis. Now, clearly, it's a humanitarian crisis, and some of the images you'll have seen reflect that humanitarian crisis. So when you go to a place like Lesvos, where as many people arrive in one day as we are offering to take in 5 years, then you can only begin to imagine what that looks like on the ground. It's dirty, it's messy, it's chaotic, it's uncoordinated, and yeah, it makes your heart bleed, actually, as a personal experience. It's also in a context, though, and that context is one of a European country, Greece, which is undergoing economic crisis, which has had resources taken away from it in return for other kinds of negotiated agreements over the euro, which has got potentially 450 million euros coming its way to help it deal with the situation, but has been told it can't have that money because there's a lack of confidence that it will go to the right places. So it literally is not being supported. We have international organizations who frankly have been incredibly slow to organize, and when they have got into the field in Greece, in the islands of Lesvos and Chios and Samos, they can't cope. And why can't they cope? It's because their manuals are designed for war. And what we have is war in peace. So we have a situation where there are the symptoms of war, the pain, the distress, the need. But we've also got tourists who would like to go about their everyday work. We've got people who want to make a journey to Calais and not be disrupted by people falling under the line as they try to get across the channel. So there's this really difficult tension between the needs of the community, the humanitarian response, and the political response, which has been very sadly lacking. And then what happens is the volunteers have had to step up. And so what you get is communities around the world, usually through social media, actually rallying themselves, sending, eBayed orders of socks and foil blankets and things that will immediately provide that kind of protection and meet some of those needs. So there is a humanitarian crisis. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting this is not so. But what I'm suggesting is that this humanitarian crisis is not because of the movement of people. It's because of the ineptitude and inability of European political leaders to come up with some sort of a solution. Now, why have they failed to do that? Well, it's a complicated scenario, and of course it changes almost on a weekly basis. But essentially what's happened in Europe over the last 20 years is that politicians have narrowed the political space within which to deal with these kinds of scenarios. So they've used migration repeatedly over the years to legitimate, to scapegoat, to make excuses for the failure to deliver services, resources, houses to their own citizens in a context where we have wealth but growing inequality. And immigrants have been used to justify that particular outcome. And when Merkel stepped up in the summer and said, look, we have to do something. We can't just sit and watch this situation unfold. I think she expected others to step up with her. I think she thought that if she put herself forward, others would join her and there would be some sense of solidarity. And of course that didn't happen. Everyone sort of backed away. And so what we see instead is, over the course of the last 6 months, 5 emergency summits that have been held by European leaders to come up with a solution, the latest of which was held in Valletta over the last 2 days, and has come up with a solution that will basically encourage, let's say, African states to dissuade their citizens from leaving in return for development assistance and also agreed readmission arrangements. There's still no consensus on the solution about what to do about this particular situation, the right now, the fact that the winter is coming and we don't know actually how people are going to survive it. There's also a huge gap between what is being promised and what is being delivered, and I saw that firsthand in Lesvos. The day that the Commissioner came to open the first hotspot in Europe, the place was immaculate. The day after, it was anything but. So there's a sort of a show of solidarity that takes place around these kinds of events. And earlier this year, Juncker, the Commission President, was asking for European states to step up and take 40,000 people of the what is now 800,000 people that have arrived through some sort of relocation scheme. There was a lot of umming and ahhing. Nobody really wanted to do it. The UK made its position perfectly clear. We're not going to be part of this. Over the summer, it became apparent that we needed a bigger response. And so Juncker went back and said, we need to do more. We need to get, hundreds of thousands of people relocated from Greece and Italy and places where they can't possibly remain because there isn't enough support for them, and it's not appropriate for one country to take that kind of influx. So we got an agreement of 160,000 places for relocated Syrians and others who would be redistributed around the countries of Europe. Great. In reality, that requires states to actually physically put in place the apparatus to make those relocations happen. And to date, we have a commitment to 854 places. And of those, 112 have been delivered. That includes 6 families, 5 Syrian families and 1 Iraqi family from Lesvos, a place that arrives between 7,000 and 9,000 people a day. So, the quality of the response to the reality of this situation is shocking. And I suppose I want to conclude really by saying that not only do I think that's shocking in terms of the particular situation of the migrants concerned, with whom ultimately I think our concerns should lie, but I think this is a real challenge to the political project of Europe. Now, bear in mind that the European Union, the Commission, was really a way of bringing states together after the Second World War. It was a way of getting the whole of Europe to kind of engage in a peace project, essentially. And my concern is that if you look at what's going on now, that political project, the peace project of Europe, is essentially being pulled back into the Dark Ages by the way in which this debate around migration is being constructed. So our friend, the Hungarian President Orbán, recently declared, if we let everyone in, we will destroy Europe. And my argument would be that it's not migrants who are doing the destroying right here. It's actually the political rhetoric of the European Union and the way in which it positions migrants constantly as being the problem. It's the way in which the language of war has become the way to talk about what is actually a crisis of humanity created by the conflicts that we see all around us. I don't have a solution to this. I despair sometimes at where things are going. What I do know is the solution at this point is not a technical one. We can have technical solutions. We can have policies and agreements and decisions. At the moment, they mean very little until you get the political will to actually implement them. So I think the first thing we need to do is to move away from the language of war when talking about a situation in Europe which is not a situation of war. We need to stop drawing battle lines between us and them, the people who are legitimate beneficiaries of the wealth of Europe and those who are perceived not to be. We need to understand that the drama that we currently see unfolding in front of us in relation to the migration crisis is not created by the movement of people, but by the inability of political leaders to deal with what they're seeing in front of them. 530 million people come to Europe every year as tourists. 30 million people move around freely as part of our labour market. We've got 800,000 and the whole system, it appears, has collapsed. So what we need to do is to build solidarity from the ground up, and we see that happening in many of our communities, and that's a really important point to build upon. And we need to maximise on the multiplier effects of that. We need to just really believe as much as we can that every single person that gets it, those consequences will ripple out to their family, their friends, their immediate environment. And if that happens enough, that can make a change. And I think just by way of conclusion, refugees are often, as I said earlier, at the beginning of what is a very hard road to hope, because the hope sits there potentially ahead of them, and the journey to reach it is very hard. And if we're going to do anything right now about that, we need to sort of step up and walk alongside them on that journey. And that's not just for their sakes, but it's also essentially in the end for our own. Thank you.